You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 8,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now, let's dive into today's story. Father Daniel Costa's hands were shaking the first time he heard them scream. It was 3 a.m. on November 27th, 2 weeks into his assignment in Section 17, and he thought he was alone in the Vatican archives. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of agony that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. He dropped the letter he'd been reading, a plea from a mother in 1847 whose son had died of fever, and pressed his palms against his ears. It didn't help. The screaming was inside his head. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse somehow, pregnant with the weight of voices that had been cut off mid-cry. Daniel sat in that silence for 20 minutes, his heart hammering, before he could bring himself to move. He should have left then, should have walked out Section 17, returned the key to Cardinal Russo, and requested reassignment to any other project in the vast Vatican bureaucracy, any other archive, any other task, anything that didn't involve spending his night surrounded by centuries of unanswered prayers. But he didn't leave, because by then Daniel had already read enough to know that walking away would make him complicit in something terrible, something that had been going on for far longer than he'd been alive. Let me start at the beginning. 7 years I worked in the Vatican's secret archives before Cardinal Domenico Russo summoned me to his office that cold November morning. 7 years of careful cataloguing, of handling documents that trace the Church's history back through centuries of triumph and tragedy, faith and doubt. I loved the work, loved the quiet reverence of it, the sense that I was preserving something important, something sacred. The Cardinal's office smelled of tobacco and old leather. He was 83, his hands liver-spotted and trembling slightly as he slid a brass key across his desk toward me. "Father Costa," he said, and his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "I have a special assignment for you. Section 17 requires documentation. You'll work alone. You'll speak to no one about what you find there. Am I clear?" "Yes, Your Eminence." I reached for the key, but Russo's hand shot out and gripped my wrist. His fingers were cold. "Daniel," he said, using my first name, for the only time in all the years I'd known him. "Once you enter that section, you cannot unknow what you learn there. Do you understand? Some truths have a cost." I should have asked what he meant. Should have pressed for details, for context, for some warning about what I was walking into. But I was young. 43 feels young when you're surrounded by men in their 80s, and arrogant enough to believe I could handle whatever historical documents the Church had locked away. So I took the key and I said, "I understand." I didn't understand anything. Section 17 was located 3 levels below the main archives, down a narrow staircase I'd never noticed in 7 years of working in the building. The air grew colder as I descended, and by the time I reached the bottom, my breath was fogging in front of my face despite it being November in Rome. Hardly cold enough for that. The brass placard beside the door was tarnished black. I could barely make out the number. The lock was stiff, and for a moment I thought the key wouldn't turn. Then something inside the mechanism gave way with a sound like breaking bone, and the door swung inward. The smell hit me first. Not decay. The documents were too well preserved for that, but something else. Something like despair, if despair had a scent. Stale air, an old paper, and something underneath that made my stomach turn. The section was vast, far larger than the cardinal had led me to believe. Shelves stretched back into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate, climbing 15 feet to a vaulted ceiling covered in frescoes so old and faded I couldn't make out what they depicted. Just suggestions of faces, of reaching hands, of open mouths. I set up my workstation at the single wooden table in the centre of the room and got to work. The first volume I opened was dated 1847. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in cramped Italian on paper that crackled when I touched it. They were addressed to God, to the Pope, to the Virgin Mary, to any saint who might be listening. Prayers, I realised. These were prayers that people had sent to Rome, hoping for intercession, for miracles, for simple acknowledgement of their suffering. The first letter stopped my heart. Most Holy Mother, my name is Caterina Rossi and I am writing from Naples. My son Giovanni is 6 years old and he is dying. The fever came 3 days ago and now he cannot keep down water. His skin burns to touch. The doctor says there is nothing to be done. The priest says I must have faith, but Mother Mary, I have faith. I have always had faith. I pray every morning and every night, and I live according to God's law. Why is this happening? What have I done to deserve watching my child suffer? Please, I am begging you. I am begging God. I am begging anyone who can hear me, save my son. I will do anything. I will give anything. Please don't let him die alone and afraid. Please. Caterina Rossi, November 3rd, 1847. I sat back from the table, the letter trembling in my hands. I'd read historical documents before, letters from people long dead, but something about this felt immediate, present, as if Caterina Rossi had written it this morning instead of nearly 200 years ago. I checked the envelope. The seal had never been broken. For 178 years, this mother's desperate prayer had sat unopened in the Vatican archives. I opened my laptop and searched the church's digitized records. It took me 40 minutes to find it. Giovanni Rossi, age 6, died November 6th, 1847, Naples, 3 days after his mother had written begging for his life. Had anyone read this letter when it arrived? Had anyone cared? I spent the rest of that first day reading. Letter after letter, prayer after prayer, all of them sealed away, without answer. A farmer begging for rain during a drought. A young woman asking for protection from a man who beat her. An elderly priest requesting guidance as his parishioners lost faith. None of them had received responses. None of them had been forwarded to any office, any person who might have helped. They had simply been filed away in Section 17, catalogued and forgotten. When I emerged that evening, Father Antonio Bellini caught me in the corridor. He was my closest friend in Rome, a round-faced priest with an easy smile and a kindness that made everyone around him feel valued. "Daniel, there you are. We missed you at dinner. Everything all right?" "Fine," I lied. "New project. Lots of reading." Antonio studied my face. "You look pale. Are you feeling well?" "Just tired." I forced a smile. "I'll see you tomorrow." But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Caterina Rossi's handwriting, the way the letters grew shakier as the prayer went on, desperation bleeding into every stroke of the pen. I kept thinking about her son, 6 years old, dying of fever, while his mother wrote letters that no one would ever read. The next morning I returned to Section 17 before dawn. Over the following days, I developed a system. Document each volume, photograph sample pages, record dates, and subjects in my official catalogue. But I also read everything, driven by a need to bear witness to these voices that had been silenced. Someone needed to know. Someone needed to remember. There was Seamus O'Brien, a farmer from County Cork, writing in crude English during the famine of 1849. "Dear Holy Father in Rome, I know you are a busy man, but my children are starving." The potatoes have all gone black. There is no food. My wife Mary died last month. We buried her in a sheet because we had no money for a coffin. My daughter is 8 years old and she has stopped crying. She just stares at nothing. My sons are too weak to work. The landlord says he will evict us, but how can I pay rent when there is no crop? Please, I am begging. Send help. Send food. Send anything. We are faithful servants of God. Please don't let us die. Seamus O'Brien, October 1849. I found the record. Seamus O'Brien and his 3 children died that winter. The farm was seized and sold to an English investor. There was the Goldstein family from Warsaw, their letter dated March 1938, written in careful German. Your Holiness, we are a Jewish family seeking refuge. The new laws forbid us from working, from attending school, from living as citizens. My husband was beaten in the street yesterday, while police watched and laughed. We have heard that the Catholic Church has helped others escape. We are willing to convert if that is what it takes to save our children. We will go anywhere, do anything. Please, we just need help. We need someone to hear us. The Goldstein family. No record existed of the Goldsteins after 1939. There was Dorothy Sullivan from Boston, her letter typed on a manual typewriter in 1962, the keys striking so hard they nearly punched through the paper. Father, I don't know where else to turn. My husband drinks, and when he drinks, he hurts me. He has broken my arm twice. Last week, he gave me a black eye so bad I couldn't see out of it for 3 days. Our priest, Father Murphy, says a wife must endure, that marriage is sacred, that I must try harder to please my husband. But nothing I do is ever right. I'm afraid he will kill me. I'm afraid my children will grow up thinking this is normal. Please, is there somewhere I can go? Someone who can help? I feel so alone. Dorothy Sullivan. Dorothy Sullivan died in 1964 from head trauma after falling down the stairs in her home. The death was ruled accidental. By the end of the first week, I'd catalogued 217 letters. Each one was a prayer sent to Rome. Each one met with silence. The weight of them pressed against my chest until I found it difficult to breathe. Father Antonio cornered me after Mass one morning. Daniel, you're not eating. You're not sleeping. What's going on with this project? I can't talk about it. Cardinal's orders. Then talk to the Cardinal. Ask to be reassigned. You're making yourself sick. But I couldn't stop, because with each letter I read, I understood more clearly what Section 17 really was. This wasn't just an archive of unanswered prayers. This was evidence. Evidence that for centuries the Church had systematically ignored the desperate pleas of the faithful, that we had built our power and prestige on a foundation of calculated indifference to human suffering. Someone needed to know. Someone needed to bear witness. It was on November 23rd, my 14th night working in Section 17, that I first heard the whispers. I was alone in the archives, working past midnight by the light of my laptop and a standing lamp I'd borrowed from one of the reading rooms. The building above me was empty, locked and silent. I was reading a letter from a woman in France, 1789, begging for sanctuary as the revolution consumed Paris, when I heard it. At first I thought it was pipes or ventilation or the old building settling, but as I paused to listen, I realized the sound had rhythm, cadence. It rose and fell like speech, like dozens of voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. I stood slowly, my heart beginning to race. Hello? My voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Is someone there? The whispering continued, unchanged. I followed the sound between the shelves toward the back of the room. It grew louder as I approached a particular section, one containing volumes from the early 18th century. I stopped in front of the shelf listening. The whispers were definitely coming from here, from the books themselves. Multiple voices speaking over each other, creating a tapestry of sound that made my head ache. I couldn't make out individual words, but I could feel the emotion behind them. Desperation, anger, grief. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started recording. For 10 minutes I stood there, barely breathing, recording the impossible sound. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, oppressive, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I actually ran, up the 3 flights of stairs and out into the cold November night, my heart hammering, my breath coming in gasps. I stood in the courtyard for 20 minutes trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, that it was stress or exhaustion or some acoustic trick of the old building. But when I played back the recording in my quarters, I heard it clearly. Beneath the static, beneath the ambient noise, there were voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking over each other in desperate cacophony. Italian, English, French, German, languages I didn't recognize, and underneath it all repeated, over and over in English, with a clarity that made my skin crawl. Why won't you listen? Why won't you listen? Why won't you listen? I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk, playing the recording again and again, trying to understand what I'd captured, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. There wasn't. The next morning, I returned to Section 17 with more recording equipment. If I was losing my mind, at least I'd document it. I set up microphones throughout the room and let them record while I continued my cataloguing work. The whispers were constant now that I'd learned to listen for them. They never grew loud enough to drown out my thoughts, but they were always present, a background murmur like distant conversation in a crowded room. I found myself pausing in my work, straining to make out individual words, individual voices among the chorus. Sometimes I thought I could hear names: Katerina, Seamus, Dorothy, the writers whose letters I'd read, their voices somehow preserved in the paper and ink and desperate hope they poured into their unanswered prayers. Over the following days, the whispers grew louder, or perhaps I was simply becoming more attuned to them, learning their rhythms, their patterns. Other archivists began avoiding Section 17. It feels wrong down there, Father Antonio told me. Cold, oppressive, like something's watching you. I knew what he meant, but I couldn't stop because I'd found something else, something that made the whispers make terrible sense. At the very back of Section 17, behind centuries of filed prayers, there was another door. Smaller than the main entrance, wooden and old, with no label or marking to indicate what lay beyond. It was locked. I asked Cardinal Russo about it during our weekly meeting. The old man's face went pale. That section is sealed, Father Costa. You are not to concern yourself with it. But what's inside, if I'm cataloguing Section 17? You are cataloguing what I've asked you to catalogue. His voice was sharp, final. The sealed section is not part of your assignment. Am I clear? Yes, Your Eminence. But as I left his office, I noticed the way his hands shook as he reached for his cigarette case. It wasn't just secrecy he was protecting. It was fear. That night, I did something I'd never done in my 7 years at the Vatican. I broke the rules. In the archive master's office, I found the keyring and borrowed it, telling myself I'd return it in the morning. Back in Section 17, working by lamplight well past midnight, I tried key after key in the locked door. Most didn't fit. Some turned but didn't catch. I was about to give up when a small brass key, tarnished nearly black with age, slid into the lock and turned with a click. I paused, my hand on the key. Last chance to turn back. Last chance to remain ignorant. I opened the door. The room beyond was smaller than Section 17, perhaps 20 feet square. But where the main section was crowded and chaotic, this room was ordered, precise, clinical. Glass cases lined the walls, each one climate-controlled, each one containing documents far older than anything I'd seen before. The whispers here were deafening. Not loud enough to damage my hearing, but loud enough that I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything except the voices screaming inside my head. I pressed my palms against my ears, and it didn't help because the sound wasn't external. It was coming from inside the room, inside the documents, inside my own skull. I forced myself forward toward the nearest glass case. Inside lay a collection of letters, the parchment brittle and brown with age, the writing in Latin so faded I could barely make it out. The date on the first letter made my breath stop. 1347, the year the Black Death arrived in Europe. My hands shook as I opened the case and carefully removed the first letter. The parchment crackled, threatening to crumble at my touch. I carried it to the single table in the center of the room and set it down under my lamp. The writing was cramped, urgent, the Latin of an educated man, writing in desperate haste. As I began to translate, cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Most Holy Father Pope Clement, I am Father Giuliano, parish priest of San Marco in Sicily. A pestilence has come to our village. It began 3 weeks ago with the Rossetti family. Now half the village lies dead or dying. The symptoms are terrible. Swellings in the groin and armpits, black spots upon the skin, fever that burns until the afflicted beg for death. The dying outnumber the living. We have no physicians, no medicine, no guidance from Rome. I am burying dozens each day, performing last rites until my voice fails. Holy Father, please, we need help. Send physicians, send medicine, send priests, send word on how to stop this pestilence. We are your faithful servants. Please do not abandon us. Father Giuliano, July 1347. I set the letter down and reached for the next one, dated 2 weeks later. Father Giuliano's handwriting was less controlled now, the lines wandering across the page. Holy Father, I wrote 2 weeks ago but have received no response. The plague grows worse. The village is now more than half empty. The survivors are mad with fear and grief. Some have fled into the countryside. I fear they carry the pestilence with them. Still no word from Rome, no priests, no aid of any kind. I'm alone here with the dying. I do not know how much longer I can continue. Please, Holy Father, send help, send hope, send anything. We are your children in Christ. Do not let us die forgotten. Father Giuliano, August 1347. Letter after letter, week after week, Father Giuliano had written to Rome. His handwriting deteriorated, with each letter becoming more erratic, more desperate. The content grew darker. He described watching children die in their mother's arms. He described the smell of mass graves, the horror of blessing corpses, piled like cordwood because there was no time to bury them individually. He described his own failing faith as week after week passed with no response from the church he'd dedicated his life to serving. The final letter was barely legible, written in a shaking hand. I no longer know if anyone reads these letters or if they disappear into the void like prayers whispered to an empty sky. The village is dead. All of them. I buried the last survivor yesterday. Old Giorgio, the blacksmith, who wept for his grandchildren as the fever took him. I'm alone here now, surrounded by silence and the ghosts of people I failed to save. I keep writing because I do not know what else to do. I keep praying because I am a priest and prayer is supposed to mean something. But I wonder, in my darkest hours, if God has abandoned us, or if it is not God, but his servants who have turned their backs. I wonder if you ever read these letters at all. I wonder if you care that we suffered, that we died alone and afraid and forgotten. I do not expect an answer anymore. I am beyond hope. But let this final letter serve as testimony. We were here. We were faithful. We called out to you, and you did not answer. May God forgive you, because I cannot. Father Giuliano, October 1347. I sat back from the table, my vision blurred with tears. Then I saw it. On the shelf behind the glass case, a single folder marked with Father Giuliano's name. Inside was a letter from the Vatican, dated November 1347, addressed to the priest in San Marco. The letter had never been sent. It read, "Remain faithful in your trials, my son. Trust in God's mercy. Continue to pray. Your suffering will be rewarded in heaven." Given at Rome, November 1347. I stared at that unsent letter and felt something break inside me. Not my faith, that would come later, but something else, some fundamental belief that the institution I dedicated my life to serving was fundamentally good, fundamentally interested in helping people. The church had received Father Giuliano's desperate pleas. They'd known about the plague consuming his village. They'd drafted a response. And then they'd filed it away, choosing silence over compassion, choosing institutional preservation over a single priest's life. I stood on shaking legs and moved to the other glass cases. Each one contained similar collections. Letters from historical catastrophes, all met with silence. The Armenian genocide, the Irish famine, the Inquisition's victims, the transatlantic slave trade. Every dark chapter of human history was represented here, and in every case people had written to the church begging for help, for intervention, for simple acknowledgement of their suffering. And in every case the church had chosen to file their prayers away rather than respond. The whispers in the room were overwhelming now, a chorus of abandonment that made my ears ring and my head pound. I could hear Father Giuliano's voice among them, and Caterina Rossi's, and Seamus O'Brien's, and Dorothy Sullivan's, and thousands more. Centuries of unanswered prayers, creating a psychic weight that seemed to warp the air itself. That's when I heard it, distinct from the whispers, louder, more immediate. A voice speaking directly into my ear in medieval Italian. Finally someone hears us. I spun around, the room was empty, but the voice continued. 700 years, 700 years, we have been screaming, and no one listened. No one cared. "Who are you?" I whispered. "You know who I am, Daniel Costa. You read my letters. You wept for my village." "Father Giuliano." "What's left of him? What's left of all of us? Our prayers soaked into these walls, into this paper, into the foundation of the church itself. Centuries of desperation, of abandonment, of faith betrayed. It leaves a mark, it leaves a stain, it leaves us." I backed towards the door, my heart hammering. "This isn't real, you're not real. We're as real as prayers can be, as real as suffering, as real as the silence that answered our cries." The voice was all around me now, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the very air. "They locked us away, Daniel. Sealed us in the dark where no one would have to hear our questions, our accusations, our doubts, because questions are dangerous. Doubt is dangerous. Better to bury us than answer us." "I'm sorry," I said, and I was crying now, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry no one helped you. I'm sorry you died alone." "Your sorrow changes nothing. The dead stay dead. But you can still do something. You can tell the world what was done to us. You can expose the machinery of silence." I thought about that. About taking everything I'd found and giving it to journalists, historians, anyone who would listen. About forcing the church to answer for centuries of abandonment. "If I do that," I said slowly, "I'll destroy people's faith. Millions of people who find comfort in the church, who rely on it for hope and community and meaning. Is revenge worth that cost?" The voice was silent for a long moment. Then, is their comfort worth our suffering? Is their faith worth our abandonment? I didn't have an answer. Over the following days, I finished my official cataloguing work, while quietly copying everything I could. Every letter, every document, every piece of evidence. I worked in a feverish daze, sleeping little, eating less, driven by the need to preserve the truth before Section 17 was sealed again. The whispers followed me everywhere now. I heard them in my quarters at night, soft murmurs just below the threshold of hearing. I heard them in the chapel during Mass, competing with the priest's prayers. I heard them in my dreams, thousands of voices, asking the same question, why won't you listen? Father Antonio found me in the archives one evening, standing motionless in front of the shelves, tears streaming down my face. "Daniel," he said gently, taking my arm. "Come on, let's get you out of here." He led me up to the courtyard, into the cold November air. I stood there shaking while he waited patiently beside me. "What's down there?" Antonio asked, finally. "What did they make you catalogue?" "Prayers," I said, "centuries of unanswered prayers. People crying out for help and being met with silence." "The church can't answer every prayer, Daniel, you know that. God works in mysterious..." "It's not about God answering," I interrupted. "It's about the church not even trying. People wrote letters begging for help and we filed them away. We drafted responses and chose not to send them. We created an entire system for ensuring that certain questions never got answered, certain suffering never got acknowledged." Antonio was silent for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." On December 8th, Cardinal Russo summoned me to his office. The old man looked ancient now, as if my work in Section 17 had aged him decades. "You finished the cataloguing," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Eminence." "And the sealed room? You found it, didn't you?" "No point in lying." "Yes." Russo nodded slowly. "I knew you would. You're too curious, too thorough, to leave any door unopened." He lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "What will you do now, Father Costa?" "I have copies of everything, documentation that could bring down the church's carefully constructed facade. I could leak it to journalists, force the Vatican to answer for centuries of abandonment." "You could," Russo agreed, "and you destroy the faith of millions in the process. The church, for all its flaws, also feeds the hungry and shelters the homeless and comforts the dying. If you destroy it, what takes its place?" "Maybe nothing should take its place. Maybe an institution built on calculated indifference to suffering doesn't deserve to exist." The Cardinal studied me for a long moment. "You're angry. You have every right to be. What you found in Section 17 it's shameful, indefensible. But Daniel, the church is made of people, and people are flawed. We make terrible decisions. We prioritize the wrong things. We fail the very people we're supposed to serve. But that doesn't mean the institution itself is without value. The people who wrote those letters didn't think it had value. They died thinking God had abandoned them when it was really us who turned away." "I know," Russo's voice was barely a whisper. "I know. And that sin weighs on my soul every day. But destroying the church won't bring them back. It won't undo their suffering. It will only create more pain, more loss, more people left without hope or community or meaning." "So what do you suggest? That I just forget what I found? Pretend those voices don't exist?" "No, I suggest you find a way to honor them, to make sure their suffering wasn't meaningless, to ensure that the church doesn't repeat those mistakes." I left the Cardinal's office with no answers, only questions that seemed to multiply with every passing hour. That night, I returned to Section 17 one final time. I stood in the sealed room, surrounded by glass cases full of unanswered prayers, listening to the whispers that had become my constant companions. "I hear you," I said into the darkness. "Caterina, Seamus, Dorothy, Father Giuliano, all of you. Every voice that cried out and was met with silence. I hear you. I'm sorry no one listened when it mattered. I'm sorry you died thinking you were forgotten." The whispers didn't stop, but Father Giuliano's voice spoke again, clearer than before. "What will you do, Daniel Costa? Will you expose us to the world? Give us our revenge? I don't know if revenge is what you need. I don't know if it's what anyone needs. Then what? I thought about that question for a long time. Then I said, I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure that when people cry out for help, someone answers. Not with empty platitudes or filed away responses, but with real action, real compassion, real presence. I can't undo what was done to you, but I can try to prevent more voices from joining yours. The whispers grew quieter, not silent, but less accusatory, as if, finally, someone had given them an answer they could accept. 3 weeks later, I submitted my resignation from the Vatican archives. Cardinal Russo didn't seem surprised. "Where will you go?" he asked. "There's a parish in Pennsylvania that needs a priest. Small town, working class families, nothing glamorous. Just ordinary people with ordinary problems." "Running away from what you found?" "No," I said, "running towards something else, toward the people the church is supposed to serve, toward the work that should have been done all along." I left Rome on a cold January morning, carrying one suitcase and a locked box full of copies that represented centuries of silence. I didn't know what I would do with them. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. But I knew I couldn't leave them behind. The parish in Pennsylvania was called St. Michael S, located in a town so small it barely appeared on maps. The church was old, the rectory older, and the congregation consisted mostly of miners and factory workers and their families. No ancient secrets here, no sealed archives, just people trying to live their lives with grace and dignity. I threw myself into the work. I visited the sick, counseled the troubled, presided over baptisms and weddings and funerals. But more than that, I made myself available. I kept my office door open. I made it clear that anyone who needed to talk would find me ready to listen. And people came, slowly at first, then in growing numbers. They told me about their problems, their fears, their doubts. They asked questions that priests had told them not to ask. They shared suffering they'd been told to keep silent about. And I listened. I truly listened, in a way I'd never fully understood the importance of before Section 17. A woman named Margaret came to see me 6 months after I arrived. She was in her 60s, worn down by life, her eyes carrying decades of disappointment. "Father," she said, "I've been praying for help with my daughter for years. She's an addict. I've begged God to save her, but nothing changes. I'm starting to think he doesn't hear me, or doesn't care." I thought about Caterina Rossi writing her desperate prayer for her dying son. I thought about Father Giuliano begging for help as his village died around him. I thought about all the voices in Section 17, all the people who'd thought God had abandoned them, when it was really his servants who'd turned away. "God hears you," I said carefully, "but sometimes his servants don't listen. Sometimes the people who should help you, who should respond to your pain, choose silence instead. And that's not God's failing. That's ours." Margaret looked confused. "I don't understand. Your daughter is sick. She needs help that prayer alone can't provide. She needs treatment, support, resources. I can't promise any of it will work, but I can promise you this. You won't face it alone anymore. I'll help you find treatment programs. I'll visit your daughter if she'll see me. I'll be here to listen whenever you need someone to talk to. I can't perform miracles, but I can show up. I can respond. I can make sure your prayers don't disappear into the void unanswered." Margaret started crying. "That's all I wanted, Father. Just someone to hear me. Just someone to care." "I hear you," I said, "and I'm sorry no one listened sooner." Over the following months, I worked with Margaret and her daughter Emily. It was messy, complicated work with no guarantee of success. Emily relapsed twice. There were setbacks and disappointments and moments when it seemed like nothing would ever change. But I kept showing up, kept listening, kept responding to their suffering with presence and compassion, rather than filing it away in some mental archive where it could be forgotten. And slowly, impossibly, things improved. Not through divine intervention or miraculous healing, but through the simple act of one person helping another. Through prayers being answered, not by God directly, but by God's servants actually doing their jobs. That's when I understood what Father Giuliano had been asking for in his letters. Not miracles, not divine intervention, just acknowledgement. Just someone to hear his suffering and respond with compassion, rather than bureaucratic silence. The church had failed him, had failed Katerina and Seamus and Dorothy and thousands of others. But I didn't have to repeat that failure. Every day, in small ways, I could make sure that the people who came to me received the response they deserved. I still heard the whispers sometimes, especially late at night when the rectory was quiet. Father Giuliano's voice, Caterina Rossi's voice, all the abandoned prayers that had soaked into my consciousness during my time in Section 17. But the whispers were different now. Less accusing, less angry. As if, finally, someone was doing what should have been done all along. 1 year after leaving Rome, on a cold November evening, I sat in my office and opened the locked box. Inside were all the copies I'd made. Photographs of letters, audio recordings of whispers, documentation of centuries of institutional abandonment. I stared at that evidence for a long time, debating what to do with it. Expose the church's secrets and risk destroying millions of people's faith, or keep silent and let the pattern continue. Then I realized it was a false choice, because the real question wasn't whether to expose or conceal. The real question was how to break the cycle, how to ensure that prayers were answered, suffering acknowledged, cries for help met with compassion. I pulled out my recorder and began to speak. This is Father Daniel Costa. I served in the Vatican secret archives from 2018 to 2025. During that time, I discovered Section 17, a collection of unanswered prayers spanning 4 centuries. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about faith, about service, about what it means to truly listen when someone is suffering. I talked for 3 hours documenting everything I'd found. The letters I'd read, the whispers I'd heard, the sealed room full of evidence that the church had systematically abandoned the faithful for centuries. But I also talked about what came after, about Margaret and Emily, about all the small ways I'd tried to make sure prayers were answered, suffering acknowledged, cries for help met with presence rather than silence. I don't know if I'll ever share this recording, I said as I finished. I don't know if the world needs to know about Section 17, or if that knowledge would cause more harm than good. But I know this. The greatest sin isn't that prayers go unanswered. It's that they go unheard. That people cry out in suffering and are met with bureaucratic silence. That institutions choose self-preservation over compassion. And every day, I try to make sure that doesn't happen. Every day, I try to listen, to respond, to show up. That's all any of us can do. Be present for each other's suffering instead of filing it away in sealed rooms where it can be forgotten. I saved the recording and locked the box away again. Maybe someday I'd decide what to do with it. Maybe someday the church would be ready to face its history and change. Or maybe the evidence would stay locked away, known only to me, a reminder of what happens when institutions value power over people. But for now, I had work to do. The next morning, an elderly man named Robert came to confession. "Father," he said, his voice breaking, "I don't know if anyone's listening anymore. My wife has cancer. The treatments aren't working. The doctors say she has weeks, maybe days. I keep praying, but I don't feel like God hears me. I feel so alone." I thought about Father Giuliano, writing letter after letter as his village died around him. I thought about all the prayers in Section 17, all the people who died feeling alone and unheard. "I'm listening, Robert," I said. "Tell me about your wife. Tell me what you need. Tell me how I can help." And as Robert began to speak, as I listened with my full attention and compassion, I heard the whispers in my mind grow quieter. Not silent, they would never be silent, but softer, less accusatory, as if, finally, someone was doing what should have been done all along, as if, finally, the prayers were being heard. But here's what I haven't told you yet. Here's the part that keeps me awake at night, that makes me question everything I thought I'd learned. 2 months ago, on a cold September evening, I received a letter. No return address, postmarked from Vatican City. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message in Latin. "Father Costa, we know what you took from Section 17. We know what you documented. Cardinal Russo is dead. He passed in his sleep last month. With him died any protection you might have had. Return the copies you made. Return the recordings. Destroy any evidence you preserved. If you do not comply within 30 days, we will be forced to take action. The Church has survived for 2,000 years by protecting its secrets. It will survive 2,000 more. Do not test our resolve." The letter was unsigned. I burned it immediately, but I couldn't burn the fear it planted in my chest, because I realized something I'd been trying to ignore for over a year. The voices in Section 17, the whispers that followed me from Rome, they weren't just psychic residue, they were a warning. This is what happens when you dare to listen, when you dare to remember, when you dare to bear witness to the suffering the Church has spent centuries trying to bury. Last week, Father Antonio called me. We hadn't spoken since I left Rome, but his voice on the phone was shaking. "Daniel," he said, "I need to tell you something about Section 17. "What about it?" "After you left, they sealed it. But not just locked the door, they bricked over the entrance, removed it from all archives maps, erased every reference to it from the catalogue. As far as official records are concerned, Section 17 never existed. Why are you telling me this?" A long pause, then, because yesterday, during my shift in the archives, I heard whispers coming from behind the wall, where Section 17 used to be. Hundreds of voices, Daniel. Maybe thousands. All asking the same question, why won't you listen? "Antonio, I know what you found down there. I know what they're trying to hide. And I think," his voice dropped to a whisper, "I think it's getting worse. I think the more they try to bury it, the louder the voices become." He hung up before I could respond. That night, I sat in my office with the locked box open in front of me, listening to the recordings I'd made in Section 17. The whispers were different now. Louder, more urgent. And underneath Father Giuliano's voice, underneath all the familiar voices, I heard something new. Recent voices, contemporary prayers, letters sent to Rome in the last year, in the last month, maybe in the last week. New suffering, new abandonment, new voices being added to the chorus of the unheard. The machinery of silence hadn't stopped when I left. It had continued, as it had continued for centuries. More prayers filed away, more cries for help met with bureaucratic indifference, more voices sealed behind walls where they could be forgotten. I thought about the unsigned letter, the threat, the warning to destroy everything I'd copied. I thought about Father Antonio, hearing whispers behind bricked-over walls. I thought about all the people who would continue to write letters to Rome, desperate for help that would never come. And I realized something that made my blood run cold. I couldn't expose Section 17 without becoming part of the problem, because if I told the world what I'd found, the Church would simply deny it, would point to the absence of physical evidence, the bricked-over entrance, the erased records, and call me a liar, would discredit me, silence me, add my voice to the chorus of the unheard. The game was rigged. It had always been rigged. The Church had spent 2,000 years perfecting the machinery of silence, and I was naive to think one priest with some copied documents could dismantle it, But I also realized something else. The whispers were spreading. Father Antonio heard them in Rome. I heard them in Pennsylvania. And if we could hear them, maybe others could too. Maybe the weight of centuries of abandoned prayers was finally becoming too heavy for even the Vatican's walls to contain. Maybe the voices were breaking free, spreading like a contagion of doubt and accusation and unanswered questions. Maybe Father Giuliano was right. Maybe we're not ghosts or psychic residue. Maybe we're something else. A reckoning that's been building for 700 years. A debt of silence that's finally come due. Last night I had a dream. I was back in section 17, standing in front of the sealed room. But the door was open now, and instead of glass cases full of old letters, the room was filled with people. Thousands of them, maybe millions, stretching back into an impossible distance. Caterina Rossi stood at the front, holding her dead son in her arms. Beside her was Seamus O'Brien with his starving children, Dorothy Sullivan with her broken arm, the Goldstein family wearing yellow stars, Father Giuliano covered in plague sores, and behind them, stretching back forever, were all the others. Every person who'd ever written to the church begging for help and been met with silence. Every prayer that had gone unanswered. Every cry for help that had been filed away. Every question that had been buried rather than addressed. They were all looking at me. "You promised," Caterina said. "You promised to make sure it didn't happen again." "I'm trying," I said. "I'm doing everything I can." "It's not enough." This was Father Giuliano, his voice sad rather than angry. "It's never enough. Because the machinery of silence is still running, still consuming new prayers, new suffering, new voices. And as long as it runs, we grow stronger. We spread farther. We become something the church can no longer contain." "What are you?" I asked. "What are all of you?" "We're what happens when faith curdles into accusation," Father Giuliano said. "When prayers become indictments. When the weight of unanswered suffering reaches critical mass and collapses into something new. Something that can't be sealed away or bricked over or erased from records. We're what you should fear," Caterina added. "Not because we're vengeful, but because we're right. Because our questions deserve answers, and our suffering deserves acknowledgement, and our prayers should never have been abandoned. We're the debt that's coming due, Father Costa, and you're the one who opened the door." I woke up gasping, my heart hammering, my sheets soaked with sweat. The clock read 3:17 a.m. In the silence of my room, I could hear them clearly now. Not just the familiar voices from section 17, but new ones, recent ones, contemporary prayers from people who'd written to Rome last month, last week, yesterday. The machinery of silence was still running, still consuming, still adding new voices to the chorus. And I realized with terrible clarity that I'd made a mistake. By trying to bear witness, by trying to honor the voices in section 17, I hadn't stopped anything. I'd only become complicit in it. Another cog in the machinery, another person who knew the truth but couldn't or wouldn't stop it. This morning, I sat down to write this account, not because I think it will change anything, not because I believe anyone will read it and take action, but because someone needs to document what's happening. Someone needs to preserve the truth before it, too, gets filed away in some sealed section where it can be forgotten. The whispers are growing louder, spreading farther. Father Antonio isn't the only one who hears them now. Last week, a nun in Madrid reported hearing voices coming from the archives there. 3 days ago, a priest in Dublin said the same thing. Yesterday, I got an email from a Monsignor in Paris describing whispers in the cathedral basement where they keep old correspondence. Section 17 exists in every major church archive, Cardinal Russo told me. Rome, Paris, Madrid, Dublin, all of them have similar collections. All of them have sealed rooms full of unanswered prayers, and now all of them are starting to whisper. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if this is divine judgment or collective psychosis or something else entirely. I don't know if the church will finally be forced to answer for centuries of abandonment, or if they'll find a way to silence these voices like they've silenced so many others. All I know is this, I opened a door that should have stayed closed. I listened to voices that were meant to remain unheard, and now those voices are spreading, multiplying, growing stronger with every new prayer that gets filed away unanswered. Father Giuliano was right. We're not just passive victims anymore. We're something else, something that's been building for 700 years, fed by centuries of abandoned faith and unanswered suffering. We're a reckoning. And we're just getting started. The whispers tell me I have a choice to make. I can destroy the evidence I collected, pretend I never found Section 17, go back to being just another parish priest serving his community, or I can share what I know, expose the machinery of silence, and accept whatever consequences come. But both choices feel like failures, because destroying the evidence means betraying everyone whose voices I promised to honour, and exposing it means playing into the church's hands, giving them an excuse to discredit me and bury the truth even deeper. There's no good option. There never was, so instead I'm writing this, documenting everything, creating a record that can't be easily erased or forgotten. Maybe someone will find it someday. Maybe they'll understand what happened here, what's still happening in sealed rooms and bricked over sections throughout the Catholic world. Or maybe this account will just get filed away like all the rest. Another unanswered prayer, another voice consigned to the darkness. The whispers tell me it doesn't matter. Tell me that the reckoning is coming, whether I help it along or not. Tell me that 700 years of abandoned faith has created something that can't be controlled, or contained, or silenced anymore. I don't know if I believe them, but I know I hear them. Every hour of every day, growing louder, growing stronger, growing impossible to ignore. Last night, standing in front of my church under the November stars, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the familiar voices from Section 17. It was singing. Thousands of voices joined together in a hymn I didn't recognize, the Latin words twisted into something that sounded less like praise and more like accusation. De profundis clamamus, they sang. From the depths we cry out, from the sealed rooms and the filed prayers and the abandoned faith. From 700 years of silence, we cry out. And this time someone will answer. This time someone will hear. I don't know what that means. I don't know what form this reckoning will take or when it will come, or what will be left of the church when it's over. All I know is that I'm part of it now. I open the door. I listen to the voices. I promise to bear witness. And now I can't close the door again, even if I wanted to. The whispers are still with me. Father Giuliano's voice clearer than ever. You wanted to honour us, Daniel Costa. You wanted to make sure we weren't forgotten. Well, congratulations. Now no one will ever forget us. Now everyone will hear what we have to say. What do you want? I asked him last night, standing alone in my office, talking to empty air like a madman. We want what we've always wanted, he said. We want to be heard. We want our suffering to be acknowledged. We want the church to answer for what it's done. And if it won't answer willingly, his voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then we'll make it answer. We'll make everyone answer. I should be terrified. Part of me is. But another part, the part that read Caterina Rossi's desperate prayer for her dying son, that translated Father Giuliano's increasingly hopeless letters, that listened to centuries of abandoned faith. That part thinks maybe they deserve their reckoning. Maybe the church deserves to answer for what it's done. Maybe we all do. So I'm writing this account and I'm locking it away with all the other evidence. and I'm waiting to see what happens next, waiting to see if the whispers keep spreading, if more priests and nuns and faithful servants start hearing voices in their archives and their basements and their sealed sections, waiting to see if 700 years of unanswered prayers finally gets a response. I'm praying, though I'm not sure who I'm praying to anymore, or if anyone's listening, that when the reckoning comes, there's something left worth saving, because I'm starting to suspect that Father Giuliano and Caterina and all the rest aren't interested in salvation anymore. They're interested in justice. And after 700 years of silence, I don't think anything in heaven or earth can stop them from getting it. The whispers are still here, right now as I write this, growing louder, growing closer, saying things I don't want to repeat, making promises I don't want to believe. But I'll tell you this, if you ever find yourself in a church archive, in a sealed section, in a room full of old letters that no one's opened in centuries, don't listen too carefully, don't read too deeply, and whatever you do, don't promise to bear witness. Because once you hear the whispers, they never stop. And once you open that door, you can never close it again. I know. I tried.